Good morning to you all. It is Saturday morning, and getting this video teaching prepared for you all ahead of our Simple Church gatherings tomorrow, Sunday, March 28th at 10 a.m. And as usual, with Zoom at noon. For those of you who are still connecting that way, look forward to meeting together and send you greetings from Wheeling, West Virginia, where I am camped out, getting ready to go and meet my wife about a little bit further down the road as they come from Indiana this morning. So pray for us as we return to New Jersey tonight and spend a little time with our son Caleb at Messiah University there near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So glad to bring this to you this morning, and quick orientation and a few announcements too. If you're connecting with us via this video for the first time, just a quick understanding of who we are. We have in this slide here that because the Bible's grand story of God's creation to new creation focused on Jesus, that's what the Bible is about, a story about that, it welcomes us to make it our story as well. We're a family of families then who worship and follow Jesus as Lord by learning to think and live wisely together by His Spirit so we can seek the welfare of our city and our world in the way of Christ and His apostles. Just again, a reminder, we'll be meeting together as simple churches across our campus tomorrow in 4 different locations, sometimes 3 if the groups, the churches, as we call them, merge. We think of them as churches in and of themselves that could exist on their own if they had to, apart from buildings in a campus, in a home somewhere, or in a public location, much like the early church was. So we call them simple churches for that reason. Because they could literally exist on their own if they had to, connected to one another by way of its leaders and things like this video and the teaching. So thinking about them that way, and we'll be talking more about that later on this year. We'll continue to mask up as we have, but it's great to see the number of people being increased who are getting vaccinations, and at some point in time, we'll have a feel of how many of us are in that spot as well, and of course following state guidelines and making shifts and changes. But things are going to probably maintain this pattern through the Memorial Day holiday, so just keep that in mind as vaccinations ramp up, and our hope is that there will be a shift over the course of the summer to things that we'll start adapting to as well in terms of how we gather and the frequency and the manner of it. But really learning, taking forward all that we've learned so far. So we'll keep you posted on that, but we're continuing just as a reminder to maintain the masking and the distancing as our vaccinations continue to roll out. Continue to look for a Monday email, that will give you an orientation to where we are reading in the Bible that week. We are reading an annual reading plan together, and this will help us all be on the same page. That email will come out early on Monday morning. If you save that and go back to it or print it off, whatever you need to do, you can use that to know what we're reading each day, both a passage from the Old Testament right now in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel as we move forward, and then there's a psalm reading for each day. There are links in that video, though, as well, to videos that often go with each day from Bible Project. And so if you keep that email in your inbox and go back to it through the week, or just take note, there are video links that you'll be able to use. This is following the exact same plan that those of you who are reading the One Story That Leads to Jesus plan in YouVersion or Bible.com. So we're following the same thing. This email just helps those of you who would rather use it and just work straight from your email, but you're on the same plan as the rest of us, as if we all started on January 1st. So that's where we should be. We'll continue to meet this coming week on Wednesday night at 7 p.m. for an hour, and praying and talking together and sharing concerns and praises and prayers in large and small groups, that we're able to do that online. And that, again, is very likely to become a very regular pattern moving forward. The efficiency and the ability to just meet together in that way weekly is wonderful, and to talk with one another And again, those of you who are not connecting with that, I encourage you to simply just to check in and say hi. Um, no guilt if you can't stay the whole time for prayer, but even if you were just to check in the first, say 10 to 15 minutes, and usually for about the first half hour we're talking or just getting oriented to things, and then going to prayer for the final half hour. It's kind of the way it works. Sometimes a little more or less, but please just check in, say hi. That really is a key thing that we're doing. And so it's a wonderful tool that we've learned to use, and we'll continue to do that moving forward. This month, we're continuing to pray for the Knorr family in the month of March, and we're in the last Sunday here. So continue to pray for them as they've made and are making the full transition to retirement in upstate New York after many, many years, nearly 3 decades in Japan. And I'm sure, like myself and the work in Albania, continuing to plan on how they're going to maintain those connections after having lived in another country that long and made so many relationships. There'll be a new way of maintaining those, but a very possible way, because of the way the world is connected now, and ease of travel and ease of communication. So pray for them as they develop new habits and new patterns from overseas back to what's been their home in Japan. We continue to work on that video series Thursday night, which is focused on grasping the big story of all stories. Think about the Bible as the grand story of all stories. It explains, it gives context and shape to all other stories within it, whether and affirms whether they're true or not. That's how the Bible presents itself to us, as the story of all stories from God's perspective, from that of the Creator. And we're invited to immerse ourselves in it and to understand it and understand particular details and things within it, but particularly as they have implications for our lives and for our world today. So that's in essence what we're trying to do on Thursday nights, is not just gather information, but really immerse ourselves in this story and become more and more familiar with it. And we'll be continuing to develop this tool as well for use when we can physically gather, but likely continuing in the manner we are now online, where you just after dinner you get online and we're able to talk substantively. We have had some substantive and significant conversations, and I look forward to when we get together at some point here in the future, of everyone giving testimony to how this has really, really shaped and informed you. We hear bits and pieces of it, but it'll be great to have face-to-face conversations about that at some time. So this coming Thursday, we'll be finishing a series we started about 9 weeks ago. I think this is week number 10 or 11. It may be actually 12 now that I think about it. But we'll be backing up and looking at the whole New Testament again. We've studied Luke and Acts as a foundation in the New Testament, and we'll look at it now as in light of the larger whole. It's always great to get the context, a larger context again. So we'll be doing that. So you'll want to watch the New Testament overview video by the Bible Project. That'll be the subject of our discussion, and trying to connect Luke and Acts with that and see the whole. Again, the New Testament is a whole with an inner logic to it that organizes it and holds it all together. So I want to make sure that we're clear on that as we end this series, and not just kind of leave it at the details of what we've talked about in both Luke and Acts, but see it in the larger context. So that's what we're doing. We got Easter week ahead of us. This is Palm Sunday coming up, and then next week is our remembrance once a year and the special time of the resurrection. Something we remember every week when we gather together. It's why we gather together, because Jesus has been raised to new life. But historically, we remember that these were things that actually happened, and we start to look at the details and get a better sense of what was going on and why. And so we'll be doing that this week, as we do each year. And this year, more so than last, we will meet on Good Friday, this coming Friday, in the main auditorium there on campus at 7 p.m. Be gathering about an hour. We're able to meet, and we know how to do that well now through since September. So we'll do that safely. Again, masking and social distancing, but it will be good to come together for a time of just special reflection and music and a time to set aside to remember the most significant thing that ever happened in human history, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, all on that weekend. So we'll be doing that. I'm asking for those of you who would like to gather on Sunday morning at 6:30 a.m. At Clifton Main Memorial Park. This is informal, nothing organized or anything, in the sense of just gathering together, and as the sun comes up, thanking the Lord for the risen Jesus, and praying for His blessing and work in the city of Clifton where we live. It's just a great opportunity to do that. So however many of us are there, we'll gather right there. And my thought is to gather at the little hill that's near the corner of Main and Park Slope. You can park right along Park Slope there. And we can gather up there and gather in a circle however many of us are there. We'll see how the weather holds up. Keep informed. I'm sure we'll get a message out on Saturday or even early Sunday morning, texting or whatever, or an email. I'll probably get an email to you to let you know that we're actually going to be meeting, and hopefully the weather will hold up that way. Then that same day, Easter Sunday, we'll meet at 10 a.m. as usual, but we'll be meeting all together in the auditorium. Simultaneously, we'll have Zoom with that. It won't be interactive. It'll be more like a live stream where you'll be watching rather than interacting with us. But that's about the best and only way we can do. So that link will be out there as well. So at least you can see and hear to some degree what we're doing there together on Sunday morning. And then afterwards, because it's all outdoors, and again, weather permitting, we'll go next door. Carefully over to our house, our home, right across the street from the church campus, and have some safe fellowship and food there, and have Easter egg hunt. So my encouragement to you is, and we'll get a link out about this, we want to try to register people so that we know how many children would be coming and who to plan for. We've got a small team that's preparing for that. But take it as an opportunity to invite someone that you know with small children, probably up to, say, 6th grade, perhaps, whatever age is appropriate for egg hunting. And that way we can just sort of introduce some normalcy back into something. This may be something that people are looking forward to. So I encourage you to pray about and think about who you could reach out to in order to invite them, neighbor, friend, anyone who has small children. And we'll try to get the word out to our Nick at Night families too, that we're going to be doing that. And I think it'd be really, really good for the kids to have a sense of something that is familiar, and families too. So be bold and full of faith about that as the week comes. I'm going to give you a quick orientation to the Gospel of Mark today. I've titled this two-part series, this week and next, The Life of Jesus Then, Given for Ours Today. And this will be an orientation to Mark in probably a way that you're not quite used to. And so there's a lot to try to clarify in a small amount of time. But I'm going to give you an orientation to it, and hopefully we can talk it through further. But I've tried to pull out some key ideas for you to be mindful of when we approach these books called the Gospels, and in this case particular, the Gospel of Mark. We need to understand what they are and to use them appropriately as both God and the authors who wrote them intended. And I want to give you an orientation to that today, because often we get lost in the details of the story of these books and not really understand what they're there for and how they fit into our development as followers, as disciples of Jesus today. And that's very, very important that we use these correctly and in appropriate ways, and be aware of that, and go back and fill in the gaps that may be there so that we can use these properly, and hopefully get an orientation to that a little bit here as well. So let's jump in. A lot of the ideas that I'm bringing to you will come from a booklet that we're going to be studying. This is a follow-up to the First Principles, for those of you who are familiar with it, and my intention is later on this year to look at a 5-part series all together, Sunday for week in and week out, looking at the 4 gospel books and getting oriented to them and understanding their role as a whole in the New Testament. And the one on Mark is called Announcing the New Community. These are books that are in the form of, like the First Principles, 5 sessions. I think Matthew might have 8 because it's a longer gospel. But where we look at an issue through the Gospels week in and week out, study passages about it, have some reading about it. It's a little workbook where you can collect your thoughts, write them down, and then we'll get together and have discussion around them on that Sunday, again in the simple church format that we're doing. So that's where we're headed. But a little orientation in the preface of one of these booklets, the one on Mark, says this, and these are also written by Jeff Reed and part of the Build curriculum, the Build resources that we use in becoming established as believers, following the apostolic pattern that we have in the New Testament of what it means to not only become a believer, become established and strong as a believer, and then to continue to be stabilized and strengthened as a community of believers. Jesus' focus is on building his church, and Mark's gospel is keenly focused on the idea of Jesus' announcement of the new community. So the preface says this: the booklet looks at Mark's intention in writing and his relationship as an assistant and interpreter of Peter. One of the reasons I wanted to go to Mark this year is because we just finished Peter's letters. Peter's letters came out before Mark's gospel did. But Mark is a student of Peter, and so Mark is an interpreter and an assistant of Peter. So we see Peter's ideas coming through what Mark is saying about Jesus for the same church network that Peter was working with. So that's an important idea to grasp. We'll talk about it more here in a minute. Participants will see the essence of the good news proclaimed by Jesus, the emerging Jewish-Gentile tension, and the announcement of Jesus' new community, including death, resurrection, and the commissioning of this new community to proclaiming the gospel. So a question that emerges, and this is one I want to talk about and have you express in your own words when we get together on Sunday. Why is Mark's gospel and the 3 other books like it in our Bible? Why are those 4 books? Why do we have 4 of them? But more importantly, why are they there in the first place? What are they intended for? How do you understand that? And how is this teaching that I'm sharing with you today help begin to change your perception of that? I'll try to orient you to that a little bit, and there'll be a lot to talk about and think about. And some of you are familiar with these ideas through some of the studies that we've done in the Build encyclicals. But here's a key idea that comes out of, again, another of these books called Mastering the Scriptures series. This is one that orients us to the 4 Gospels. And the key idea is this: we will make the case that the Gospels were written to the churches with the intent of solidifying the churches as charismatic communities. Then we will look at two of the primary focuses of Jesus' work during his 3 years of ministry: announcing his new community and commissioning his new community. To accomplish this, he was busting up the Jewish tradition, veiling much of his teaching until later, when it could be plainly delivered through the apostles, infuriating the Jewish leaders and his insinuations of being the Messiah, creating disequilibrium in the disciples, and marching toward his death and resurrection. We will establish that Jesus' plain teaching is in the letters of the apostles that were written to the churches. Key point there. Thus, the Gospels need to be read having all of the plain teaching of the epistles already in mind. So this introduces the ideas that we're talking about here and orienting the Gospels, and not only in their the purpose of their writing, but in the content of their writing as well. And this may be a set of new ideas for many of you who've been in the church for years, but it's very, very important that we understand the order of things and the nature of things as to these documents we call the Gospels. They can be confused and distorted with serious implications for Jesus' plan and our lives and our maturity as believers. So some thoughts that derive out of this, in this idea from Jesus to the Gospels. The apostles and the churches only fully understood the life and teaching of Jesus as recorded in these Gospels, these 4 books, only after having been established in the clear teaching we read and learn in the letters. So again, think about this. The letters and the teaching that we have of the apostles is what's out there first. That came first. And the churches that they established, then the Gospels were written, 2 of them by apostles and 2 of them by associates of the apostles, Mark and Luke. In particular, Mark interpreting and assisting Peter, and Luke interpreting and assisting Paul. So that gives you an orientation a little bit there as well. Again, I say in the second point here, for example, Peter's letters were written before Mark's Gospel. So the first letter that we just read from Peter, was just studied over these last few months, that was written before Mark's Gospel was. So why is that important? What's going on there, and what's Mark doing in light of that? Mark is in essence summarizing or interpreting Peter's gospel message into a narrative about Jesus to make this new community strong and stable. So the chief argument is the Gospels were written to the churches. They were not written as evangelistic tracts to bring people to become followers of Jesus. They have that effect and can have that effect, but only through the churches that they stabilize. Once the church is in place, the good news people are existing, and that's the way the kingdom advances. And so the establishing of churches is what the Great Commission is about. Not just saving individuals, but establishing these communities, because that's how other individuals become followers of Jesus as well, and it multiplies out into the world. That's what we see in the plan, particularly in Luke and Acts, for those of you who've been studying that on Thursday nights. We need to read then and use the Gospels like Mark in this way today in order to become mature and strong together in his work. So it has a very, very unique and special role for us as churches today, and we need to keep that in mind and use these Gospels this way. So this opportunity to look over these 2 weeks at Mark, given the Easter time when we intensely look at the story of Jesus, gives us an opportunity to think about this. So first, what we then have are the statements or proclamation that was delivered by the apostles for salvation and the creation of a new community of the church. In other words, the gospel message, the gospel with a little g, not the books here, but the message about Jesus that people were, it was proclaimed to them, and which they were challenged then to embrace and make their life orientation. The gospel that we have responded to, all of us, and we'll look at that in detail here in a minute. We see this in Peter's sermons in Acts, for example, 10:34 to 34, I should say, 34 to 48, and Paul's statements like 1 Corinthians 15:1 to 4, and I would extend it 15:1 to 6. You'll see here in a minute. So first we have the statement, the oral declaration of the basic things, in almost in a formula-like pattern that you see in the New Testament, what Jesus has done and what we need to do about that, or how we need to respond to that, and that's what we see going on. So that's the gospel that is proclaimed. Then was the clear teaching of Jesus delivered to the churches to establish them in the faith, the first principles, in order that they might understand their unique identity and purpose together at the center of Christ's plan. So this helps understand why we have such this large body of work. 13 letters from Paul, letters from John, letters from Peter, letters from James, the letter to the Hebrews, the letter from Jude. Those are all there functioning in a way to deliver the clear teaching of Jesus to these new communities that the proclamation, the spoken or declared gospel, the things about Jesus, was creating. Then was the writing of the Gospels, the big G Gospels, the 4 books we have to strengthen the churches in the kerygma message. And you'll see we keep using this word kerygma over and over again, and there's a reason why. And it's a very helpful category, but it's a very, very foundational category too. The kerygma message they originally received and be shaped by it in order to further its message to others. I mentioned this idea to as well a couple of weeks ago when we were ending First Peter, to think about the importance of some of those names and things that come at the end of the letters that are more than incidental details. They give us insight into what was going on in the early church. And what we talked about were three key networks of churches: the Gentile churches that we see develop in the book of Acts through the three missionary journeys that Luke and Paul give evidence to. Luke in his gospel in Acts, and then Paul in his letters, but the role he plays in Acts. But you have the Jewish diaspora churches, which are primarily the focus of Peter's work, but Peter through Mark and the gospel that he's written here, but Peter wrote his letters himself with the help of his scribe Silas, as we saw. But Matthew's gospel then builds on that as well and addresses that same network of churches, as do the letters from James and Hebrews and Jude as well. But then you have the network of 7 churches that are primarily the focus of John's ministry and John's writing. So first you would have his letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, then his gospel being written to those churches, and then finally Revelation. The revelation that we have there. So this is what's going on. And just a quick quote. I didn't want to put all of this down in front of you, but hopefully, listening, you can capture the sense of this. As you read Peter's writings, notice that there was concern that his network of churches stay strong in the faith and not go back to their old beliefs after the apostles left the scene and as persecution increased. We saw that in our study of 1 Peter. Peter writes to Jewish churches scattered across the empire, encouraging them to stay strong. In 2 Peter, he warns them that many false prophets have gone out into the world and they need to hold fast to this gospel, kerygma, that they have received. He was concerned with stabilizing the churches. Just as Luke was a key co-worker of Paul, so John Mark was of Peter. See 1 Peter 5:12-14. Mark was working as Peter's key assistant and amongst the same network of churches. We're helped in our understanding by a quote from Papias. Papias was a bishop of the Christian community in Hierapolis, a city of Asia Minor, in the early 2nd century, and Mark was recorded by Justin, a church historian, to be Peter's interpreter, who wrote accurately all that he received from Peter. We will look at this more in depth in the second booklet in this series, the one on Mark's Gospel that I talked about earlier. Thus, Mark would have shared many of Peter's concerns for his church network. Most believe that Matthew worked with Mark's outline and built comprehensive theological treatise definitively establishing the Gospel's Old Testament continuity. Thus, it was essentially intended for the same audience as Mark's Gospel. So that gives a little bit of explanation to the Jewish churches and Peter, and then particularly Mark's role via his Gospel. So when we talk about the kerygma, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the basic formula of the things that we see the apostles, particularly Peter and Paul, and Peter in this case from Acts 10:34-48, saying. And here it is. Every nation is now acceptable to God. The good news is for all. The message has been made known in the life and work of Jesus according to the Scriptures. This is consistent with the Bible as one story from beginning to end, with Jesus as a centerpiece. Jesus Christ is Lord of all. That's the good news. God has now become King in this one called Jesus the Christ. Jesus the Messiah, the Anointed One, the King. Christ means King. But this particular man, this Israelite, born into the family of Abraham and David in fulfillment of all those prophecies. So each one of these is like a suitcase that has a bunch of stuff packed into it. But the essential things are right here, and then they can be further unpacked. Jesus' work began with the baptism of John, identifying with the new freedom from slavery that he was bringing, demonstrating God's time to return and fulfill. That's what was going on in the baptism there. Why was Jesus baptized? He was identifying with this message that God was now coming back, and the time of new exodus, of freedom from slavery was approaching, and he was going to be the one that led his people through that and represented them. He went about doing good and signs of coming renewal. These miracles, as we study Mark later on this year, affirmed Jesus' authority, who he was and what he was doing. He died on a cross, was buried, and raised to new life on the third day. He will return again to judge and renew all things. Judgment and renewal go together. It's not just punishing bad things or bad people. It's renewing His creation. It's removing the yeast from the dough. It's removing the corruptibility and the defectiveness and the brokenness of creation, and particularly in us, and making all things new, back to God's original project, on track that it was in Eden. Everyone who believes this message and inclusion in God's renewing has forgiveness and inclusion in God's renewing work and future. So this forgiveness is needed by us now, and brings us into what God is now doing in the world and creating this new worldwide family, this new covenant community that points to what God is going to ultimately do in the future. So what we have in the church, the local church, and every local church, is what it looks like now that God has inaugurated this in Jesus. Jesus has inaugurated the new age. He's inaugurated His new community. He's inaugurated His kingdom. His kingdom has been inaugurated, but what has yet to be consummated. In other words, fully and completely done. And that's what we wait for when Jesus returns. We live in between those two times, the beginning and the ultimate end. That's why the invitation now is, make this part central to your life. God's inviting you into this. Do it now while you can, and become part of what God is doing in the world, so that you ultimately also are part of it when He comes and completes it. That's the context of the message that we live and share with others. Don't be left out. Now is the time to turn away from what you think is ultimately valuable and ultimately true, what your life purpose is about, and put God's purpose in that place, and find that it is the most important thing you could do in your life. So another key idea, we need to read and interpret the Gospels through the eyes of churches who already possess this teaching. The things that were unclear to the apostles during Jesus' time here on earth were now clear to them. Thus, a recording of what they now clearly understood needed to be told afresh in the form of these Gospels, including Mark, that we're looking at this week and next. The churches needed to know clearly what Jesus had done, so they would understand the whole context of His proclamation of the gospel. As we shall see, the Gospels were clearly needed to stabilize the churches in the kerygma, the proclamation of Jesus they had so heartily embraced, in order to keep them strong as the eyewitnesses were passing off the scene. That helps also understand what these documents are and what Mark is. So my question is, what is your sense in how the Gospel of Mark stabilizes the first principles-based faith of believers and churches? And again, this Gospel assumes that you've already received and embraced the clear teaching of Jesus we have in the first principles. In other words, the teaching of the apostles in the letters. That's a very important point to remember and understand in terms of what the Gospels are and what they do. So what's your sense of how Mark, in an initial reading and understanding of it, stabilizes the faith of those who have already been grounded in the first principles, the apostles' teaching that we get out of the letters? Mark starts his gospel through a few of the images that I pulled from the video that I shared with you this week. Right in the beginning, he says the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. He states it right up front what he's going to do. But this is the root. This is the founding. This is where it all. I'm taking you back to the core things and giving explanation to them, building the story of Jesus' life around them, so that you will be stabilized and strong. Think more about it. The Bible Project gives us an orientation to how this book works in terms of its literary design and structure. You can see there from 1 to 8, and then the core at 8:27 through chapter 10. And we'll pull a few of those things from there. Particularly there in 8 to 10, we see Jesus making 3 core announcements, and that's where the heart of his gospel lies. That's the heart of the kerygma from Jesus' perspective, and Mark builds this story around it, and I think these guys have captured that in terms of the who in the front half and then the how afterwards. But Jesus' statements appear in this core. There in the middle, chapters 8:27 to 10, 8 and 10. But what do we mean kerygma? Let's go back and look at that real quick, because maybe some of you aren't clear on that yet. And why do we use that term? Why don't we just say gospel? Why don't we just say evangelion or some other word, or good news? Well, this captures what the early church understood, and when we understand it, we can sort of clear away all the baggage that this idea of good news and gospel has gotten over the years. We can go back and rethink it afresh, and I think that's the value of using a term like kerygma and going back and thinking about it at its core. But what do we mean by that? Well, this is a definition out of the booklet here on Mark. This is the term used by the early churches to describe the announcement of the good news, the proclamation, which began with John the Baptist and Jesus. For example, Mark 1. It was shaped into a gospel statement by Peter. So you see 5 sermons in Acts where Peter does this, and you can examine those yourself. Was passed down to the churches in a formulaic-like statement as affirmed by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 1-6. So you see Paul summarizing this formula that we talked about earlier. The early churches referred to this as the kerygma. Jesus' proclamation included the good news that the kingdom was near. Our proclamation must include that the kingdom has been inaugurated as his church. Very, very important point there too. Our proclamation must include that the kingdom has been inaugurated as his church. That's what God is doing. This is what Jesus' kingdom began to look like early on. And when Jesus said the kingdom was near, when he fulfilled what God had promised to come and do for the nations, this is what it looked like. Based on who he was and what he was doing and the message about him, they began to form into these new communities, this new covenant community. And that's what Jesus' intention had been all along, and that intention has not changed, because he has not yet come back to fully complete his kingdom. So we are today, and this message is what goes out and continues to create the community that demonstrates who Jesus is and what he has done. Peter talks about it in one of these passages here. This is one of Peter's sermons, where you see the formula of the kerygma that we looked at earlier. This is his meeting in Cornelius' home. Then Peter replied. You know the story, the backstory, I should say, of Peter seeing the vision and Cornelius also being visited by an angel, and then the two of them coming together, and Peter having an opportunity for the first time to bring this good news message, declaring it, proclaiming it to people who are outside the nation of Israel. Peter replied, I see very clearly that God shows no favoritism. In every nation he accepts those who fear him and do what is right. This is the message of good news for the people of Israel, that there is peace with God through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. You know what happened throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee, after John began preaching his message of baptism. And you know that God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power. Then Jesus went around doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. And we apostles are witnesses of all he did throughout Judea and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a cross, but God raised him to life on the 3rd day. Then God allowed him to appear, not to the general public, but to us whom God had chosen in advance to be his witnesses. We were those who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And he ordered us to preach everywhere and to testify that Jesus is the one appointed by God to be the judge of all, the living and the dead. He is the one all the prophets testified about, saying that everyone who believes in him will have their sins forgiven through his name. Even as Peter was saying these things, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who were listening to the message. The Jewish believers who came with Peter were amazed that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out on the Gentiles too, for they heard them speaking in other tongues and praising God. Then Peter asked, can anyone object to their being baptized, now that they had received the Holy Spirit just as we did? So he gave orders for them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. Afterwards, Cornelius asked him to stay with them for several days. So we see here, and I've highlighted and read the formulaic statement, the key things that Peter repeats time after time when he gives a declaration or a proclamation of the gospel, and the effect that it had in essentially bringing these people into the family of God that had already been created in Jerusalem through Peter's earlier sermons and the work of the apostles there. Paul summarizes this in 1 Corinthians 15, 1-6, and it's interesting to look at it. Let me now remind you, dear brothers and sisters, of the good news I preached to you before. You welcomed it then, and you still stand firm in it. It is this good news that saves you if you continue to believe the message I told you, unless, of course, you believe something that was never true in the first place. So I'm assuming you believed everything I brought to you, and this is why you are who you are. I passed on to you what was most important and what had been so also passed on to me. Christ died for our sins, just as the Scriptures said. He was buried and he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the Scriptures said. He was seen by Peter and then by the 12. After that, he was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive, although some have died. When we look at Mark as well, we see these kinds of summary ideas, or he's building from these statements as well. Mark 1, 1-4 and 1:14 give evidence of it. Again, this is the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. It began just as the prophet Isaiah had written, "Look, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you, and he will prepare your way." This is God returning, just as Isaiah had been pointing to. With the purpose of renewing all things. He's a voice shouting in the wilderness, "Prepare the way for the Lord's coming, clear the road for him." This messenger was John the Baptist. He was in the wilderness and preached that people should be baptized to show that they had repented of their sins and returned to God to be forgiven. You can see how Mark is building around Peter's core statements there. He goes on in 14. Later on, and after John was arrested, Jesus went into Galilee, where he preached. That's the word kerugma or caruso that the kerugma term comes from, proclaimed or preached. Often we think about preaching as a man in a suit standing in front of a church and a pulpit. That's not what that means. It means the proclamation. Anyone who stands up and proclaims good news to people. In Roman times, it would have been about the announcement of the heir to the throne. Caesar's had a son. A messenger would come into town, stand in the town square, and he would say, Caesar's had a son, we have an heir to the throne, or good news, Caesar won a battle at such and such a place, the peace has been secured. That was good news. That was a proclamation. And then preach God's good news, the evangelion. That's where the word evangelism comes from, the good news. Proclamation of good news. And the good news is in this formulaic statement that we see Jesus declaring and giving to everyone, but particularly to the apostles, and Mark building around those core statements and core ideas that we saw in Peter and in Paul as well. The core of Jesus' announcements, that I said, is there in Mark, the middle section of Mark, and these are right here, and Jesus repeats it 3 times. Very, very important when you see something repeated like this and taking note of it. Mark 8:31. Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. 9:30-31. Leaving that region, they traveled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there, for he wanted to spend more time with his disciples and teach them. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed in the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead." Almost verbatim, like the earlier announcement. Mark 10:32-34. They were now on the way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were filled with awe, and the people following behind were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was going to happen to him. "Listen," he said, "we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him, but after 3 days he will rise again." Again, you can see this repeated statement that Mark puts into, builds the story around at the core of what Jesus is doing, and the twist and the turn from the earlier part of the book, who Jesus was, to how to how that was demonstrated after these things. And another key phrase then that leads to where to us today, and to ponder and to think about. as we get towards the end of this today. Mark 10:42 to 45. Just after Jesus has made this statement for the third time, Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them, but among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is a key statement from Jesus that's built right on top of these three statements about what's going to happen to him. Because this is what I'm going to do, you must and will be this kind of a community. You need to be shaped by these things that I will do. And if you're shaped like it, the things that I have done will continue to be proclaimed and carried out to others, because that's what I've come for. Very, very important set of ideas at the core of Mark's gospel here. So how does this change your view of the Gospel of Mark, the things that we've talked about so far? Why does it matter? Let's talk about that tomorrow. Again, take note of these three questions. And by the way, you'll have the slides again in a link down below in this video that you can click on, and it'll pull it up and you can view them. And I think you can download them too. If you have any problem with that or need to do that, let me know. But I usually also send it out in the a copy of those slides I can send out in the email on Sunday morning as you get that. So summarizing what we have here in Mark then, in essence then, Mark is a very tight charismatic statement recording Jesus' three formulaic statements surrounded by a short, quick-to-read narrative, the Gospel of Mark, which sticks to the charismatic framework. So Mark has built a story around these core ideas of the good news, this formula that the apostles delivered, deeply rooted in the things that Jesus is saying here at the core. And we'll study this more when we look at Mark in more detail later on. It's very important to realize, why does Mark read the way that it does? It's very different from the other Gospels, very short, very quick, lots of action. But Mark it's almost like a revolutionary tract. I've heard one scholar talk about it, and it does read that way. But remember, even today, we're here on Palm Sunday, a challenge to us. He came as a king. That's what Palm Sunday was about, and then was ultimately demonstrated the following weekend in his death, burial, and especially his resurrection. But is there proof in your life of this, in our lives of this? Is there enough proof in our lives together that Jesus is king? Are we so shaped by this message that it's clear to everyone else that Jesus is Lord of all and King of all? Is that true in your life as an individual? Is that true in your family? Is that true in all of us together? This is a message that the Gospel of Mark was written to challenge us on constantly. Are we completely shaped around these things, around the clear teaching that we received, and is it working itself out in such a way that Jesus' good news is being demonstrated? So as we look at the week ahead, Jesus' trial and the Passion Week, and ultimately his death, burial, and resurrection, here are some thoughts about what I challenge you to do this week in light of even beginning now. Think and reflect on this teaching. Bring your own insights and questions to our discussion time this Sunday. Watch the videos, both from the Bible Project and this one, several times. And throughout the week, there's also an overview of Mark that you'll be able to watch too, that I'll make a link to. Make every intention and plan to read through the whole book of Mark in the week ahead. What day will you do that in time? Make a plan. Get it on your calendar. I'm going to sit down for an hour, 2 hours, and read the book of Mark start to finish. What day are you going to do that? Make that commitment and sacrifice in the week ahead. Reflect on the three core statements Jesus gave, Mark 8:31, 9:30 to 31, 10:32 to 34, and how that informs who you are and who we are as a community. Think deeply about that. Look at those statements together and think about what they mean and the significance for us today. Why is this message so needed today, and how can it shape and strengthen us to meet that need? Does God's world or the world we live in still need this message today, as we thought about it deeply and as we think about what Mark was doing in his gospel? And if so, How does it strengthen us? How can we become the people that are shaped to meet that need and to actually do that? So um, again, thanks for your time, and look forward to meeting together tomorrow. Pray that you have a great rest of the day.